He stopped speaking after the fire. She read to him every evening for a year. The scar on my left hand starts at the base of the thumb and runs up into the wrist, where it goes white and pulls the skin tight when the cold sets in. I used to rub it without knowing I was doing it. My daughter pointed that out to me years later. She said, "Papa, you rub that hand every time you go quiet." I hadn't known. You stop tracking yourself after a while. You just go where the quiet takes you. That's where I was for a long time. Not drunk, not crazy, just gone. Present enough to get the work done, to feed the horses, to keep the stovepipe from clogging, to sign what needed signing at the bank in Morrow. But gone. Anyone who'd known me before would have told you the same. Walt Prout would have. Doc Haverson, who set my arm after the cross-fence post gave way in '81. They'd have looked at you and said, "That ain't Amos Cutter anymore. That's what's left of him." The fire was in October of 1882. I won't go into what I lost. Some things you don't put words to because putting words to them makes them smaller than they were, and what I lost was not small. A woman and a boy. My woman and my boy. The house gone, the barn half gone, and me with burns on my left hand and forearm and the left side of my neck where I tried to go back in. Where I'd been pulled out. I don't remember who pulled me out. Sometimes I think I made that up, the hands on my coat, because there was nobody close enough. But I came out, one way or another, and they did not. I spent the winter in the line shack on the North Quarter. It was 8 by 10 and it smelled like old rope, and I did not mind any of it. In the spring I moved back and built a one-room structure on the foundation of what had been the kitchen. Not a house, a room. I did not see the point in a house. I had a cot, a stove, a table, one chair. I kept the ranch going because it had to be kept going. The cattle didn't care what I'd lost. I talked to the hands when I had to. I talked to Walt about the grazing lease when the county sent a man out. I did what was required. But somewhere in that winter in the shack, something in me had just closed. Not broken, exactly. Closed. Like a door you don't open again because nothing on the other side is worth the cold coming in. People in Morrow tried the first year. Women from the church came out twice and left food on the step. I thanked them. I meant it, I think. But I had nothing else to give them, and after a while they stopped coming. I don't blame them for that. There's only so long you can try to reach a man who doesn't reach back. The second winter I barely left the property. Sent one of the hands, Kel Dunbar, in to get supplies. February of that year I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd spoken out loud for more than a few sentences together. Not that I was trying not to. There just wasn't anything that needed saying. Kel knew what to do. The cattle knew where the water was. The silence had gotten into the habit of me, and I into the habit of it. Morrow got a new school teacher in the late summer of 1883. I know that because Kel mentioned it on one of his trips in, the way he mentioned anything sideways, like he was just filling time. Woman from Ohio, he said. Widow. Took the Caverly house on the east edge of town. I nodded and went back to the tack I was mending. I didn't meet her for another 6 weeks. What happened was this. I came in for supplies myself for the first time since the previous spring, because Kel's horse had thrown a shoe and I didn't want him walking the road with a loaded pack. I was at Birch's loading sacks of flour and cornmeal onto the wagon when I knocked a book off the counter. I didn't know there was a book on the counter. I picked it up and a woman said, "That one's mine, if you don't mind." I looked up. She was maybe 40, 42. Dark hair going gray at the temples, pulled back plainly. Brown dress, not new but well kept. She was looking at the book in my hand with an expression that wasn't impatient exactly, just direct. Like she was used to saying what she meant. I handed it to her. She looked at it, then at me. She said, "You're the man with the ranch on the North Road, Cutter." I said yes. She said her name was Nora Vane. Said she'd heard about the fire. Said she was sorry. She said it plain, the way you'd say it if you meant it but weren't going to make a performance of it, and that was the whole conversation. She put the book in her bag. Birch finished loading my flour and I drove back out. I thought about her 3 or 4 times in the following 2 weeks. I don't know why. There was nothing particular about the exchange. but the way she'd said she was sorry, plain, no performance, kept coming back to me. I hadn't had many people say it that way. Most people say they're sorry and their eyes are going somewhere else, or they're waiting for you to tell them it's all right so they can feel they've done something. She just said it and let it be what it was. In October, almost a year to the day after the fire, though I was trying not to count, one of my fence lines on the west side came down in a wind storm, and 12 head got onto the Riddle property. Riddle wasn't a difficult man, but he wasn't a generous one, and I knew I had to go in person and square it before he started counting days and charging me grass fees. I drove in, sorted it out with Riddle, and on the way back through town I stopped at Birch's for lamp oil. Nora Vane was there again. This time she was buying chalk, of all things, a whole box of it, and she was asking Birch if he had any more because the children went through it faster than she'd expected. Birch was apologizing because he didn't. She noticed me and gave a nod, the kind that means she remembered who I was and wasn't going to make it into anything more than that. I got my lamp oil. I was nearly out the door when I don't know what made me turn around. I said, "I have books out at the ranch. I don't use them, if you need them for your school." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "What kind of books?" I said I didn't know exactly. My wife had collected them. I hadn't looked at them since. She said she'd come out on Saturday and have a look if that was all right. I said it was. I drove home not entirely sure what I'd done or why. My wife's books were in the room in a crate I hadn't opened. I knew that. I hadn't been able to open it, but I'd offered them up like they were nothing, like they were just sitting there in a barn available for anyone, and now a woman I barely knew was coming out on Saturday. I spent the next 4 days moving around the property doing things without finishing them. I cleaned the stove twice. I thought about sending Kel into town to tell her not to bother, but I didn't. She came Saturday mid-morning, driving a little bay mare she'd hired from the livery. She tied up at the post and came to the door, and I let her in. The room wasn't much to look at. She didn't look at it the way people look at a room that isn't much, that quick survey that takes everything in and files it. She just looked at where the crate was, because that was the thing I'd indicated. I got the crate out from under the cot where I'd pushed it. I hadn't lifted the lid. I did it now in front of her, and I don't know what I expected to feel. What I felt was nothing, which was what I felt about everything, and I was grateful for that. Nora knelt down and went through the books carefully, one at a time, the way you'd handle things belonging to someone. She didn't read the titles out loud. She just looked. She took 6 books for the school. She looked up at me when she'd stacked them and said, "Are you sure about these?" I said yes. She said, "I'm obliged to you." She meant that too. She always meant what she said. She was tying the books into a cloth at the door when she stopped and said, "Do you have anyone to read to you?" I didn't understand the question at first. I said, "I don't need anyone to read to me." She said she knew that. She said it was just that she'd heard from Kel Dunbar's wife. She said it plainly. She wasn't embarrassed about having heard that I'd gotten quiet, that I didn't speak much. She said she'd found, after her husband died, that being read to was different from reading yourself. She said you're inside your own head all the time when you read. Someone reading to you puts a voice in the room. Sometimes that was enough to remind you there was a room. I didn't say anything. She waited, and then she said, "I could come on Tuesday evenings if you wanted." She said she wasn't offering out of pity. She said she didn't much like pity herself and didn't deal in it. She said she was offering because she had the evenings free and because she thought it might do some good, and if it didn't she'd stop. I don't know why I said yes. I think because she wasn't asking me to feel anything or say anything or get better in any particular way. She was just offering a voice in a room. She came Tuesday evening. She sat in the one chair and I sat on the cot, and she opened a book, not one of my wife's books, one of her own, and she read. She had a clear, even voice, not theatrical, not trying to perform. She read the way you'd talk to someone who was listening. She read for about an hour, and then she stopped at a natural place and said good night and left. I sat in the room for a long time after. I couldn't have told you anything that had happened in the story. I hadn't tracked it, but the room felt different. Felt occupied in a way it hadn't been occupied for a long time, even though she was gone. The sound of a voice reading takes a minute to fade. I'd forgotten that. She came the next Tuesday, and the next. I started listening after a while, actually following the story. The book was about a man traveling through country he didn't know, making his way from one place to another by a series of mistakes and corrections, and something about the plainness of that suited me. I didn't say much during the readings. Sometimes she'd stop and tell me what she thought about something the author had done, just a sentence or two, and then she'd go back to reading. She wasn't requiring my opinion. She was just saying what she thought. By December, she'd finished that book and started another. By January, I was sometimes looking up when she read a line that interested me. Once, I remember this because I didn't expect it, I said something. I said, "That doesn't sound right," the way he described the river. She stopped reading and looked at me. She said, "How do you mean?" I said, "A river that wide and that cold doesn't move like that. The current does something different." She looked at me for a moment like she was registering something. Then she said, "You're probably right," and went on reading. That was the first time I'd volunteered an opinion on anything in more than a year. I don't want to make this into more than it was, the way things get made into more than they were. It wasn't that I said one thing and the door flew open. It was slow. The way a fire catches, not all at once. You think it's not going to take, and then one piece of wood finds the heat and the rest follows slower than you'd expect. And then one morning you wake up and there's more warmth in the room than cold. February, snow on the ground hard enough to creak. She came Tuesday as usual. I'd made coffee, which I hadn't thought to do before. She noticed but didn't say anything about it. We drank it before she read. She talked a little about one of her students, a boy named Clement who'd figured out multiplication in a way she hadn't expected, and it was delighting her. She wasn't performing delight. She was just telling me about it. I said, "How old is he?" She said 8. I said, "Smart kid at 8 usually stays smart." She looked at me over her cup. She said, "You sound like you know something about that." I said I might. I didn't go further than that. She didn't push. She opened the book. But something in me had moved that night. Not enough to see from the outside. Just a degree or two off where I'd been sitting for a year and a half. I thought about the boy, my boy, more that February than I had in a long time. His name was Cass. He'd been 7 when he died. He'd been working out multiplication in a way that surprised me too, lining up stones in the yard in rows, squinting at them. I'd stood in the barn door watching him and thought, where did that come from? Smart kid at 7 usually stays smart, except when he doesn't, except when the house burns. I don't know when I stopped keeping that out. I'd gotten good at keeping it at the edge of things, past where I could see clearly. And then one night in February, after Nora had read for an hour and gone home, I sat at the table and I was just with it. Cass with his stones in the yard. Clara at the stove, the sound she made when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. The smell of the house before. Pine and coffee, and the particular soap Clara used on her hair on Sundays. I didn't break down. I didn't weep on the floor. I just sat with it for a long time, the way you sit with a fire that's doing its job, and at some point I got up and went to bed. But something had changed. Letting yourself feel the grief straight on without flinching, that's different from carrying it pushed sideways. It's heavier, but it's yours. You can put it down occasionally. You can't put down what you won't pick up. Nora came the next Tuesday and the Tuesday after. By March I was talking more, not a lot, but enough that a conversation would start sometimes before the reading and run for half an hour. She told me about Ohio, about her husband, a quiet man, she said, a good man, a surveyor who'd caught fever on a job out past the Missouri and not come back from it. She said she'd been with him 11 years and that she missed him, but not the way she used to. She said grief was funny that way. You think it's going to stay the same size and it doesn't. It changes shape on you. I said I'd noticed that. She looked at me. She said, "I thought you might be starting to." That was not a moment I made anything of right then. It was just a thing she said, but I thought about it later. She'd been watching, not in the way people watch you when they're worried or curious, the way you watch something you care about, the way you check on the thing that matters. April, the ground softened. I was working more, getting out further on the property, doing things I'd let the hands handle all winter because I hadn't cared. I put in a full post endrail on the north fence. I fixed the barn roof. I was in the yard one morning and I noticed the cottonwood by the water trough had put out new leaves, and I stopped and looked at them for a minute. Just looked. I hadn't done that in a long time. Noticed something that was just good to look at. Nora came Tuesday. I put a lamp on the table that hadn't been there before, a better one, more light. She sat in the chair and I sat on the cot, and she looked at me for a moment before she opened the book. She said, "You look better, Amos. You look like you're coming back from somewhere." I said I thought maybe I was. She said, "I'm glad." She opened the book and read, her voice in the room steady and clear. Outside the window, the dark prairie, the lamp throwing its circle. I listened, really listened, to the shape of the sentences, the way a story moves when someone's put real thought into it. I thought I should tell her that some of these are actually worth something, the books she's been reading. That whoever put this particular one together knew what they were doing. I didn't say it that night. I said it the following week, and she looked at me with something in her face that wasn't quite a smile but was something near to it. Not a smile you'd see right away, the kind that comes from the inside, and she said, "I know. That's why I picked it." June, and she'd finished 2 more books by then. We were reading a third, something about men running a trading post up in the Canadian territories. Hard winter, hard choices. I liked it. One evening I read to her for about 20 minutes when she'd mentioned her eyes were tired from a long day of chalk and small handwriting. I picked up where she'd left off and read. She sat back in the chair and closed her eyes. When I stopped at a chapter end, she opened them and said, "You read well." I said I used to read to my boy. She nodded. That was all. That was enough. There was an evening in late July when something shifted. Not dramatically. I'm not a man who does things dramatically, and she wasn't a woman who required it. What happened was she'd come on Tuesday as usual and we'd read for an hour, and at the end of it she closed the book and she didn't move to go. She sat with her hands in her lap and she said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Are you doing all right, Amos?" Not the way people ask it when they're being polite. The way she said it meant she actually wanted to know. I thought about it for a minute. I said, "I think I am. I think I'm doing better than I was." I said I thought she'd had something to do with that. She said, "I just read to you." I said, "I know." I said that mattered more than she might think. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at me and she said, "I'm glad I came out here. I wasn't sure I was going to when I first thought of it. I wasn't sure it was my place." She said, "But I thought somebody should, and I had the evenings." I said, "I'm glad you did." She said, "So am I," and then she said, "I think I've been coming as much for myself as for you lately. I thought you should know that." I didn't say anything right away. I let that sit for a minute, what she'd said, let it be what it was. Then I said, "You can keep coming if you want, whether or not we always read." She looked at me then, really looked, the way you look at something when you're deciding whether it's true. Then she said, "All right. There's a thing that happens between 2 people who have been sitting in the same room for a year when one of them says something real. The air changes, not dramatically, just settles. Like it had been holding something and set it down." She didn't leave right away. We talked for another hour, just talking, the book closed on the table between us. She told me about a letter from her sister in Ohio, and I told her about Kel Dunbar's youngest, who'd taken to riding along with the hands and who had a natural seat on a horse that nobody taught him. We talked like people who knew each other, because we did by then. When she finally stood to go, I walked her to the door and she put her hat on and she turned and she looked at me and she put her hand on the left side of my face, the scarred side. She touched the scar along my jaw and neck, her hand flat and steady, Not careful the way you'd touch something you were afraid of hurting. Just there, present, her hand on the side of my face. She looked at me the whole time. She said, "Good night, Amos." I said good night. I stood in the door and watched her ride down the track until the dark took her. The night air was warm and there were sounds in it. Crickets, some bird off in the grass somewhere, the horses moving in the corral. I stood there longer than I needed to, taking it in. The sounds of it, the fact of it. I'd had a woman put her hand on me in friendship and care, and something that might be, in time, more than that. A good woman, a real one. One with her own losses and her own sense and her own way of doing things. And she'd looked at me, the scarred side and all of it, the silence and the years of gone-ness, and whatever was left of me on the other side of all of that. And she'd put her hand on my face and said good night like I was worth saying good night to. Like I was worth coming back to. You don't know what that is until you've been a long time without it. You don't know what it costs a person to keep coming to a quiet man's room on Tuesday evenings for a year without asking for anything back. What it takes. She hadn't done it out of duty. She'd done it because she'd seen something worth coming to and had the guts to keep showing up. There are men who deserve that. I don't know if I'm one of them, not all the way. But I was standing in that doorway in the warm night listening to the crickets and the horses, and I felt, for the first time in close to 3 years, like I might be becoming one again. She came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. Some evenings we read. Some evenings we just talked. By fall we'd worked our way into something neither of us named for a while, because neither of us needed to name it to know what it was. The first morning she stayed for breakfast I made eggs and she made biscuits, and she knew where I kept the flour without being told, because she'd been coming long enough to know the shape of the room. She set 2 cups on the table, and we sat across from each other in the early light, and there was nothing that needed to be said. I've thought about that morning 100 times since. The particular light in October, low and golden, coming in flat across the table. Her hands around the cup, the steam rising. The sound of the horses out in the corral. And the weight of the room, not the heaviness it used to have, but the good kind of weight. The weight of something being present, being here. I still rub the scar on my left hand sometimes without knowing I'm doing it. Old habit. But when I do it now, Nora reaches over without looking up from whatever she's doing and covers my hand with hers, easy and plain, and I stop. Just stop. And the room is quiet in a way that's full rather than empty. That's all I have to say about it. That's all it needs.